Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're looking 24 hours after the Canadian capital, Ottawa, usually a sleepy place, just says panelist Keith Spicer, 24 hours after it was under lockdown with a gunman killing a soldier in front of a war memorial outside Parliament, going into the building, a shootout ensuing. We're talking about it with Canadian journalist Keith Spicer, who covered Ottawa back in the day.
Yes, there was a time.
And as the author of Sitting on Bayonets, America's Endless War on Terror and the Paths to Peace. Also with us, Christopher Dickey, foreign editor at the Daily Beast. From London, Haras Rafiq of the Quilliam Foundation. And in Washington, he teaches at Georgetown Law. Daoud Kerala, welcome back to all of you gentlemen. Lots of reactions, as we were saying, coming in from viewers. One from Damien saying the people behind this week's attacks are Canadians, not even from countries where we're involved in military actions. Haras Rafiq, has the profile of these homegrown jihadists changed?
Yeah, I think the profile has changed slightly, but I think the mechanism on how they become the vehicle that's used for radicalising them has changed and evolved somewhat. There are essentially two parts of the preventative measures that we can take. There is the sharp end, and that's the end where we actually look at people once they've been identified as showing support for terrorism, for violence, either preparing for or going out and joining an organisation. And of course, these two particular guys who carried out the attacks in Canada fit into that category. I think there we need to look at focusing on the intellectual, the social, the emotional and spiritual deconstruction of the narratives and the ideas that actually take them there in the first place. But I think there's a wider part, and absolutely right, as one of the viewers pointed out, these are Canadians. These aren't foreigners. These are people, Canadians, that have a different faith that they follow. And I think that for far too long, Islamist organisations like the Muslim Brotherhood, funded by countries such as Qatar, have been spreading this utopian Islamist Caliphate project idea for decades now without being challenged. And I think that there is a growing demand, and there has been for a long time, for us to counter the narrative in that space, so that we have the resilience inbuilt amongst people who happen to be Canadian Muslims, French Muslims, British Muslims, or whatever, so that they have this resilience to push back when people like the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafi jihadis are trying to indoctrinate them with these worldviews. So I think that the profile of the person has changed somewhat. The areas where these recruiters are working are still the same, but the mechanism that they're using has gone from a real-world scenario, which could be mosques or community centres or even gatherings in the streets, to the offline world, which is social media. And I think that as the West, we're actually playing catch-up, and we're doing it very, very poorly.
All right, speaking of what's happening digitally, journalist and blogger Glenn Greenwald, who helped Edward Snowden leak the NSA eavesdropping scandal, he wrote a piece saying every time one of these attacks occurs, Western governments pretend it's just some sort of unprovoked, utterly senseless act of violence. Far from being the byproduct of primitive and inscrutable religions, that behavior is the natural reaction of human beings targeted with violence. Christopher Dickey.
Well, you know, there is something to that. I mean, the fact is that the United States, for instance, tended, even before 9/11, to go to war against somebody just about every year. We bombed Iraq, we bombed Libya, we bombed lots of places. We bombed Serbia. I know because I went to a lot of those places to watch the bombs fall. And the Americans didn't even remember that they did it. It was incredible. They would just turn the page and move on. But of course, all the people on the ground do remember. And the sense of grievance, the sense of anger builds up. And what happens with these jihadis, these homegrown jihadis in the West, is that all becomes part of the ideological framework that sucks them in. There's videos of people being bombed. There's videos of maimed babies. We're always talking about victory. The Muslim press is always showing victims. And that all plays on the emotions of these kids who basically want to see themselves as heroes going out to save these people. And I think that there is something to that. But all that said, of course, the U.S. is going to be held responsible, but the U.S. did not create these people. The U.S. bombing raids on Libya, the U.S. efforts to save the Bosnian Muslims, none of that had anything to do with creating the particular factors that lead individuals to take a gun and kill a man standing in front of a memorial and shoot up the Parliament of Canada.
Daoud Hara, do you agree?
Well, to a large extent, it is true. But on the other hand, the U.S. has been directly promoting, and indirectly through its friends, the work of these jihadists, at least in the last 3 years, where we have witnessed a huge growth in the jihadists, what they call the Arab Spring. The U.S. has known about all the derivatives of Al-Qaeda in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, all over, and the U.S. had Al-Qaeda as an enemy. Yet it didn't pay enough attention to the possibility, because there are some, I don't know, decision makers here who believe that they can control the behavior of these guys. They don't realize that some of them would go independent and do things that would be harmful to us. The real problem is we tend to put muscles and throw bombs at a problem that initially has to, we have to apply a lot of brain to see why, what motivates a young man to go kill himself and be perceived by his peers as being a hero. What is this attraction and what is being done about it? This, I think, we have done very little. And this is what is, in this respect, the U.S. and the West are responsible for the growth of this Islamic political discourse, the fanatic discourse, as being the normal discourse to recover whatever rights, to put in the right place some kind of justice. In this respect, the West has not done what it ought to do.
Keith Spicer?
I would not go as far as to say that the Americans are a blind elephant rampaging around the world, bombing people. I'm agreeing with you, Mr. Dickey.
Well, we knew who we were bombing.
Yes, yeah. It was. I'm sure you enjoyed the show. I think we have to talk about something, and I know if I use the word soft power, you're going to hammer me very hard for being a Canadian. I plead guilty. I like to call it smart power. And the smart power I see in dealing with the situation we have, obviously in the short run, we have to fight. We have to join the coalition. We have to bomb the living daylights out of those guys. But at the same time, we need to develop for the first time a propaganda strategy as good as that of Britain in World War II. We have nothing like that. We're not using humor, mockery, for example. In French, you say ridicule kills, and we're not using that. You don't have to attack the prophet to use humor, for heaven's sake. But the main thing is to look at the roots of the real problem, which is girls and women. Don't laugh, please. I honestly believe in the long run, and that's why Malala got the Nobel Prize the second time. It's because when a girl is educated, a whole family gets educated, and a mother can start a business and so on. The men, I'm sorry to say we're all men here, are just not trustworthy.
Well, in fact, the ISIS propaganda, part of the crusade, is you get to conquer all those lands and enslave the women.
Yeah, yeah. Exactly.
That's part of that's literally one of the promises.
So Haras Rafiq?
I think that we need to put aside a couple of things here. First of all, the US and Western foreign policy currently in the Middle East has not created this phenomenon. This phenomenon was created decades ago with the advent of Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and the Jamaat Islami, who wanted to try and reclaim what they claimed were the former glory days of Islam. And secondly, there is a genuine need right now from a humanitarian level and from a strategic level in protecting ourselves in going and intervening in Iraq and Syria. You know, if we didn't and we don't intervene, there would have been tens of thousands of Yazidis that would have been killed. There would have been a massacre in Kobani. Yes, we have to intervene, and yes, it's the right thing to do. However, I also agreed that the concepts of soft power, this ultimately, from a generational perspective, is a battle of ideas. It's a battle of conquering hearts and minds. And the propaganda tool, the propaganda battle has to be fought and it has to be won, both online and in the real world. And it's not just the women. I think it's generally every single person, because just a very, very quick anecdote. There is a lot of talk about vulnerable individuals. Well, every single person is vulnerable. There was a colleague an ex-colleague I used to work with who used to be a recruiter for Hizb ut-Tahrir, and he tells a story of how he once was on a train and he saw a woman who was wearing a hijab. He identified her as being Muslim. She had a child with her, and the story that which she was reading was about paedophilia. He very quickly was able to create a rapport and build a perceived personal crisis that the West, the capitalist West, was immoral and paedophilia existed, and eventually ended up creating a lens through which he recruited her to radicalization, to Hizb ut-Tahrir. And then we all know that Hizb ut-Tahrir is one of the pathways that certainly for some organizations and for some individuals to become terrorists. The soft power, the soft propaganda war, the education, the emotional, spiritual and emotional, the social aspects of the struggle must be something that we've got to take on long term. And genuinely, I don't believe that any country in the West currently is doing this properly. We've been trying to do it here in the UK for a while, but this current coalition decided that they wouldn't do it.
But Haras, I'll put it to both you and Christopher Dickey. If this soft power has to be done over the internet, how do you go about it?
Well, I mean, I think as I'm listening to Haras, I really love the work that Quilliam does. They know how to speak to jihadis in their own language, and they know how to deconstruct the jihadi ideology. What I don't hear from anybody is the alternative narrative. I don't hear what it is that you offer to these young men and women that motivates them, that inspires them, like the stuff they're seeing from ISIS, which is a clear, simple, it may be crazy if you and I look at it, but it's a clear, simple message: righting wrongs, bringing justice, defending Sunnis, fighting against the Crusaders, and it all works out. Between video games and raw emotion, it all works very well with people in their teens and their 20s. What is the West offering? The United States doesn't even say that we stand for truth, justice, and the American way anymore. We stand for the 1%. We stand for global markets. What the hell do we stand for that's going to speak to those kids? I don't know. I just don't know.
I agree, and if you look at the record of U.S. in propaganda in the Arab world, they used a woman executive from Revlon who made lipstick. She told other women in the Arab countries that she wears lipstick and drive a car. That was not the solution. I think there's a serious danger we're going to end up agreeing on a lot of things here, because in the end, the immediate war, the violent one, has to be fought. We have to be there. Secondly, there has to be a war of ideas, and thank you to our colleague for defining it so clearly. This is a war of ideas.
All right, so
it's nothing else but a war of ideas.
The war, you're saying, has to be fought. 2 weeks ago, Canada, which again stayed out of the U.S.-led 2003 invasion of Iraq, voted for intervention this time. This after a sometimes impassioned debate in Parliament.
The Canadian Parliament voted in favour of strikes against the Islamic State organisation on the 7th of October. It was a close vote.
Nays contre, 134, 134.
Stephen Harper's ruling Conservatives did not have cross-party support, amid concern details about the mission were lacking. 6 Canadian fighters, along with support aircraft, and 600 personnel are being sent to Kuwait for a mission the Canadian government says should be for a maximum of 6 months.
As we deploy our CF-18s and Hercules aircraft in support of the fight against ISIL, all Canadians should be proud of our men and women in uniform who are dedicated to providing safety and security whenever they are called upon.
Canada has also deployed advisors to assist Iraqi security forces on the ground and has sent 1 million kilos of military equipment to the country. It joins a US-led 40-country coalition against the Islamic State organization, saying it is currently tracking 90 Islamist extremists identified as likely jihadist volunteers in Canada and abroad.
And as you saw in that report, that vote in Parliament taking place on October 7th, at the time, the opposition putting forth a salient question. Intervention fine, but what's the plan?
Haaretz is reporting that more than 6,000 fighters joined ISIS in just the first few weeks after U.S. bombing began in Syria and Iraq. In one case alone, 73 fighters joined ISIS in Aleppo right after multiple civilians were killed in the first round of airstrikes. Doesn't the Prime Minister realize that these current tactics, the same ones he wants to follow, will only create more recruits for ISIS and can, in fact, be disastrously counterproductive?
Daoud Harala, your thoughts?
Well, I think the use of force is justified, and it's justified to the extent that it is effective. And we know that the use of the brain is not only just, it's necessary, and it has not been used. I dream to see several universities, institutions of higher education, think tanks, or whatever, focusing and driven by values that we can be proud of, focusing on solving this problem. Solving this problem on the ground, for example, this flow of ISIS candidates, how does it continue? This funding, we don't know enough. And I think if we are serious about solving this problem, eliminating the danger, we have to apply the brain power and whatever funding. I think any group of think tanks or universities, whatever, would be much cheaper than 1 or 2 missiles that we are deploying there. The issue is being dealt with in a cavalier way and in a way that is not effective, and the danger continues.
All right, a comment coming in from Facebook from Matthew. We Canadians are too strong ever to be intimidated. Christopher Dickey, let me ask you about the point that Daoud Harala made earlier, which is why doesn't this coalition take its argument to the UN Security Council, so at least the use of force gets grounded more into international legitimacy?
Well, I think there's a desire to do that, but I think the first thing was the desire to start going into action and not to get bogged down in the Security Council where we're going to be contending with Russia, which is saying we don't want intervention. We have a very complicated situation where some of our friends in the Security Council, France, for instance, feels we should be doing more against Assad. Russia's going to defend Assad. We barely talked about Assad. It's an incredibly complicated and difficult situation, which is why I think President Obama decided at the end of the day, we will just go after ISIS. We will train people to go after ISIS on the ground. They're not going to be guerrillas that are going to go after Assad. They're going to be people who are trained to kill ISIS. That's the idea. It still doesn't solve the problem of the counter-narrative. It doesn't solve the problem of what we say we're going to do. The Kurds, who are fighting like hell in Kobani, they have a counter-narrative. They have a narrative of independence, of dignity, of pride. The Sunnis, we have to turn in Anbar province and in Deir ez-Zor in Syria, they're not hearing from us any counter-narrative that makes any sense to them. And let's put aside all the Americans and Brits and so on who join. Let's talk about them. They're not hearing anything from us that says we're going to help them out.
Keith Spicer?
I like the phrase counter-narrative because it evokes the war of ideas. And I think if we're talking about how leadership, which is the core of the issue, the leaders we have are lawyers, career politicians. They know very little about mass psychology except to get elected, and sociology and so on. I don't think they've read any of the UN reports on the promotion of Arab women and so on, which are devastatingly positive for what we're saying. What I think is needed is to organize somehow a vast seminar of the people who matter. Not just us, 4 of us, but I mean a group
big
of...
enough for you?
No, it could be. Well, as long as you're I don't need to be there. But I think there's lots of intelligent people in the world of culture and history who could be brought on side. give them a deadline of 6 months to design a program. I have a fantasy which will get me laughed out of the studio, which I think is very, very practical. Somehow we send 100 million Kindles, give them away, and they're preloaded with the best literature of all cultures. They're handed out in a very subversive way to kids all over the world, in Pakistan, for example, and in the Arab world. This could be done.
Let me ask,
Haras, be reading jihadist literature.
No. The thing is, these would be bad. These would be preloaded and they'd be fixed.
I don't think so.
No, well, wait a minute. I've thought this through a little bit.
You're right. I am laughing you out of this.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Haras Rafiq, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that there are two things that we need here. First of all, from a societal perspective, we need a civic society response. The response should not come from governments. It needs to come from societies. And we need to make Islamism just as unpopular, just as unfashionable as fascism has become, as communism has become, and other hate-based ideologies have become as well. So that's first thing, and that needs to come from the society. We know how to do that with those ideologies. Let's do it and bring the whole of society together, because this is not just a problem for Muslims, this is a problem that affects us all. Secondly, in the online world, one of the things that we've been proposing, and hopefully, we may well start doing soon in certain parts of the country, is that by working with social media giants, by working with internet service providers, we need to take real-world activists and empower them through the creation of a hub and get them working online, rather than just banning websites, which seems to be one of the reactions, certainly from our government. Just ban the websites. We need more again, counter-narratives, but we need civic society and activists who believe in the positive role models, the positive values that we all believe in, which is liberalism, secularism, democracy, human rights and equality of the rule of law for all. Let's promote these online. Let's create some sort of civic society response, both in the real world and in the online world. And that's the only way we're going to be able to get the counter-narratives that we have and other organisations have into the world and start this generational struggle of hearts and minds.
All right, getting the point across, that's where we'll leave it for now. Haras Rafiq, I want to thank you for joining us from London. I want to thank as well Daoud Herala for being with us from Washington here in the studio. Keith Spicer, Christopher Dickey, don't go away. Media Watch is next here on France 24. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Evening, Francois. Looking at this issue as well, we'll start with a cartoon which was in the one of the Canadian newspapers, the Chronicle Herald, and it shows the fallen soldier by the name of Corporal Nathan Cirillo, and that happened, of course, at a war memorial. And you can see that he has made the statues on the war memorial lean down to the latest war hero. So that's just one way in which the events of yesterday have been depicted in cartoon form. Now, to break it down generally into two, I suppose, crude themes in terms of the media coverage. Canada, the idea is in pieces, says Stephen March, this in Esquire magazine. The Canada I believed to be so safe, so secure is gone. All of that was the Canada of my youth. This is a new low. Elsewhere, a theme that comes back again and again, or an expression that comes back again and again, an end of innocence in Canada. I suppose in particular by contrast to the US, south of the border. Ottawa shootings, an end of innocence in Canada. You see that expression coming back also on social media. And to counter that, you have Andy Carvin, who put this thought forward. I think it was lifted from an article in the Toronto-based Globe and Mail. Don't let the seat of government become a fortress. Now, that theme was picked up in the editorial of the Globe and Mail, which said, after the attack, we are still Canada. And they point out that, I suppose, contrasting again with the US situation, politicians in Canada move around pretty freely. They move around like normal citizens. On the front lawn of Parliament, Parliament in Ottawa is an open space where people can play frisbee and generally
do yoga.
Exactly. Whereas I suppose that's not the case on Capitol Hill in Washington D.C. And we like Canada this way, says the article. In light of the events that have happened this week, Canada may have to change, but whatever changes we choose to make should be done carefully and calmly, balancing up freedom and safety, not a panicky reaction to a very small number of men who pose no threats whatsoever to the survival of Canada. So a very liberal response, I suppose, in that editorial of the Globe and Mail.
All right, James Creedon, I want to thank you. I want to thank our panel as well for joining us. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.